papers in the session. So we have to pack these papers in 1 hour. Yes.
Yeah, that's one, yeah.
Yeah, so 20 minutes for each paper. Please don't be offended when I remind you that the time is almost over or something. But, you know, you have to either to speed up or to stop at a moment because this time regime is important. So I would like to ask Andreas Lipovsky from Leibniz. Sorry, I have to take off my glasses. Leibniz, sorry, I would not pretend that I speak German. Leibniz Zentrum für Literatur und Kulturforschung Berlin. Sorry. The floor is yours, 20 minutes, and please.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. Unfortunately, I have some issues speaking today, and so I'll do the best I can to present this paper in a manner that is convenient for you to listen to. But please bear with me if I might not be able to project my voice as I would like to. My approach to Malinowski's legacy originates in an interest in the intellectual and cultural history of participant observation. While there is no shortage of inquiry into ethnographic method, a significant factor in this debate remains highly understudied, in my opinion. I hold that both Malinowski's contribution to field-work methodology and participant observation in general need to be understood in the context of the European body-centric thought and practice of that day. More precisely, Lebensphilosophie and vitalism, both as philosophical currents and popular movements. In this talk, I would like to lay out the core of this argument, as far as Malinowski is concerned, and then explore his legacy in those sections of 20th and 21st century anthropology that emphasize embodiment. At the turn of the 20th century, vitalist ideas were particularly pervasive in the German-speaking world. Body-centric practices such as sunbathing, nudism, vegetarianism, sports movement, but also more ambitious programs such as the Lebensreformbewegungen or neo-pagan spiritual movements emphasized human embodiment and sought more holistic ways of living and community. These sentiments in part responded to the rapid industrialization of the second half of the 19th century that left an increasing section of the Central European population stranded in precarious urban conditions. The appeal of the respective practices of physical culture, but also the popularity of vitalist thinkers, especially Friedrich Nietzsche, increased drastically throughout the Kaiserreich and into the Weimar Republic. As such, vitalist sentiment is a core facet of the experience of modernity and a well-established phenomenon in German cultural history. Participant observation, however, is rarely mentioned in this context, and this realization is really the point of departure for my larger project. Contemporaneous to the proliferation of vitalist ideas and practices, the history of anthropology was also going through a body-centric transition. It consisted, as we all know, of new methods for first-person data gathering and promoted the personal immersion of a researcher in a specific social and cultural setting for intensive studies. In my larger project, I look at the historical figures most closely associated with participant observation in order to uncover biographical and intellectual connections to the broader body-centric currents. Naturally, Malinowski is a protagonist for this investigation. His is also an interesting case as his notion of embodiment remains by and large implicit. Consider these well-known sentences from the introduction to the Argonauts. There's a series of phenomena of great importance which cannot possibly be recorded by questioning or computing documents, but have to be observed in their full actuality. Let us call them the imponderabilia of actual life. Here belong such things as the routine of a man's working day, the details of his care of the body, of the manner of taking food and preparing it. End of quote. Malinowski then assumes that there's an aspect of everyday practices that cannot be understood fully by conversation-based modes of inquiry. Instead, as he continues, he advises the researcher to take part in these practices and mimic them. And I quote again, "In this type of work, it is good for the ethnographer sometimes to put aside camera, notebook, and pencil and to join in himself in what is going on. Out of such plunges into the life of the natives, I have carried away a distinct feeling that their behavior, their manner of being, and all sorts of tribal transactions became more transparent and easily understandable than it had been before." End of quote. In other words, the ethnographer is advised to study a society through their own experience of its practices. The body has the faculty to understand, according in this argument, by creating an experience through mimesis, and the ethnographer is said to greatly benefit from this understanding. These well-known deliberations may sound trivial to the contemporary reader. It may seem self-explanatory to us that we may come to a better understanding of cultural matters through first-hand experience. I argue, however, that Malinowski's insistence on experience and participation is indicative of an epistemological position that allows us to place him within a very specific constellation in the history of European thought. The attribution of an alternative kind of knowledge gained through a person's embodied existence denotes a decisive development in the history of 19th century continental philosophy. The body became a focal point in this tradition in an attempt to overcome what was understood as the excessive emphasis on rationality in German idealism. Within the array of thinkers who proposed such notions, Malinowski's ideas resonate most strikingly with Arthur Schopenhauer. In his treatise Die Welt als Wille und Vorstellung, Schopenhauer proposes that the human body is given to understanding in two dimensions. It can either be understood as part of the external world or as an object among objects, or through introspection, by making oneself conscious of what Schopenhauer calls the will, that manifests itself in one's experience of one's own body. This embodied dimension is understood by Schopenhauer in his own words, a knowledge of its very own kind. End of quote. This alternative type of knowledge allows the thinking subject to gain insights into the world unattainable by a rational approach. Thanks to Peter Skalnick's and Robert Thornton's publication of Malinowski's early writings, there is an established link between Malinowski and Schopenhauer. Malinowski wrote an unpublished student essay in 1904 devoted to Friedrich Nietzsche's The Birth of Tragedy, and in its introduction he elaborates on Schopenhauer's metaphysical system, an influential source of Nietzsche's book. In this essay, Malinowski rejects the metaphysical implication of Schopenhauer's will, yet grants that the concept points to a psychological structure that governs our experience of the world. And I quote from this early essay, "Schopenhauer's metaphysics expresses certain psychological realities. Schopenhauer's will is thus a subjectivized reality." End of quote. This early essay provides a genealogy for Malinowski's thought on ethnographic fieldwork and, in my view, an exciting avenue for understanding participant observation more broadly. If, to Malinowski, Schopenhauer's conception of the will is based on certain psychological realities, the immersive aspect of his ethnographic methodology mobilizes this notion for ethnographic fieldwork. The idea that the body provides a genealogy of its very own kind stands firmly in the Lebensphilosophie tradition, and it is in the backdrop of this tradition that Malinowski articulates the participatory and immersive notions at the core of his methodological contribution. I would like to emphasize two things. First of all, this is not supposed to be a reading of Malinowski that replaces other kinds of genealogy that other people have been drawn. And I'm well aware that there's a lot of inquiry into ethnographic method. I just believe that it's one way to read Malinowski's contribution that emphasizes certain aspects that might be well overlooked from our contemporary perspective. And if you look at certain other ways that this genealogy has been drawn, for example, how Stocking has made an effort to show how immersive fieldwork practices developed within UK ethnographic methodology prior to Malinowski, is actually, you can actually combine these perspectives quite well, because what I'm talking about is the way Malinowski articulates these ideas specifically in the introduction to the Argonauts. So this is not meant to replace other kinds of explanations, but to add a facet to this discussion. And the other aspect I would like to emphasize is that intellectual and cultural history are very closely entangled in this case. Malinowski was acquainted with protagonists of the young Poland movement, and this connection is of significance to this argument. In this kind of intellectual circle, Nietzsche, for example, would not have been read merely as a philosophical contribution, but as a writer of broad cultural and social significance. And this is actually a phenomenon that is well established in German cultural history, that thinkers like Nietzsche in particular, but also other philosophical contributions at the time, were of great cultural significance and inspired a lot of thought in very different areas, and should not be considered academic contributions in the way that we today are prompted maybe to read contributions of intellectual circles because of the fragmented way our academic systems work today. And especially what is forgotten often is that this thinking in this particular historical context developed a countercultural significance, which is especially relevant once we turn to Malinowski's legacy in the discipline. To me, free publications mark the transformation of Malinowski's work from a contemporary contribution, a living thought, so to say, to a historical reference point for the discipline of anthropology. These are Men and Culture, edited by Raymond Firth in 1957, which was the first attempt to assess Malinowski's contribution to the discipline 10 years after his death. I.C. Jarvis' The Revolution in Anthropology in 1964 opened up a debate about the systematic inaptitude of functionalism to address problems of culture change. And of course, Malinowski's Diaries in 1967 confronted the discipline with the uncomfortable reality that Malinowski, in his actual fieldwork practice, did not always live up to the standards he articulated. I find the quick temporal succession of these contributions particularly interesting. Malinowski apparently gets enshrined as an emblematic figure of the discipline at the very moment that significant shortcomings of his legacy come to the fore. All readings of Malinowski's contribution, of course, also serve the rhetorical purposes of their writers. Through the 1970s and 1980s, in the context of US-American anthropology, dialogical anthropology, the writing culture debates, the advent of feminist and post-colonial critiques, for many writers, Malinowski served as an emblem of positivism and scientism, someone who was trying to cast anthropology in the image of the natural sciences, and they were producing an ethnographic genre that centered on the authority of the researcher and didn't take their positionality sufficiently into account. If we take Malinowski's association with both the Lebensphilosophie tradition and vitalist discourse more broadly seriously, this narrative gets more complicated. There is, of course, no shortage of instances in his work in which he mobilizes the authority of the natural sciences for rhetorical purposes. At the same time, it is quite remarkable to hear Malinowski reflect on the status of anthropology as a science in other places. We find one of the most far-reaching assessments of a very different kind in an article entitled The Rationalization of Anthropology and Administration, published in 1930. Tellingly, the caption of the section reads, "The Curse of Science," and I quote from this article at length, as I assume that this part of Malinowski's thought is rather unknown to present-day readers, and if I remember correctly, it hasn't come up in this conference so far. So a quote from this article from Malinowski in 1930. "Science is the worst nuisance and greatest calamity of our day. It has made us into robots, into standardized interchangeable parts of an enormous mechanism. It pushes us with relentless persistence and a terrible acceleration towards new forms of existence. It changes the world around us. It transforms our inner selves with an uncannily thoroughgoing penetration. Modern man has to start with a standardized level of taste and develop an indefinitely elastic nervous system, all at the cost of originality and spontaneous life. This may be the extreme pessimistic view of progress, but many of us feel it strongly and see a menace to all real spiritual and artistic values in the aimless drive of modern mechanization." Naturally, in the polemic that ensues, and it goes on like this for a couple of pages, Malinowski does not cast his resistance to the dehumanizing agency of science within the framework of his postmodernist critics. Instead, these characterizations of science and technology echo the sentiment of his own day. He employs anti-progressivist tropes very common at his time. And I actually looked into activist literature in German journals, and you can actually find from people who work within the Lebensreformbewegung and things like that, you find the very same tropes. Science figures not as neutral pursuit of knowledge, but as a burden and danger to society. technological progress is made responsible for the acceleration of everyday life, mechanization of labor, standardization of experience, and ultimately the death of spiritual pursuit and artistic creation. In short, science and technological progress connote the end of everything humane about the human existence. And later in the article, Malinowski explicitly casts the experience of ethnographic fieldwork as a glimpse into a purportedly more benevolent state of humanity. Now, of course, this passage is from a minor article, but its significance in the context of my argument is that it corroborates that Malinowski was well versed in vitalist discourse. I am dwelling on these connections because I believe that we can learn something from them about the history of empiricism. If you follow my argument, we come to the conclusion that someone who believes their body will understand cultural practices through their participation in them can hardly be deemed a positivist in any conventional sense. Instead, and this is the argument I would like to propose, we should appreciate Malinowski's epistemological stance, especially as far as ethnographic fieldwork is concerned, as comprising a theory and practice of embodiment avant la lettre. Because in the second part of the 20th century, post-structural revisions of late 19th century continental thought led to a heightened interest in the body. Nietzsche in particular has seen a virtual renaissance in the 1960s and 1970s and greatly influenced prominent writers of the time such as Michel Foucault, Deleuze, or Roland Barthes. Embodiment theory virtually exploded in Anglophone anthropology about a decade later and is still very influential in present-day debates. These approaches center the emotions, the senses, or affect. They are branches of phenomenology, phenomenological, and existential anthropology. Positional epistemologies in feminist and post-colonial thought probably perform the most radical break in Enlightenment rationality. If, therefore, Malinowski invented participant observation with Schopenhauer and Nietzsche in mind, it places his contribution within the purview of what Thomas J. Czordasz termed embodiment as a paradigm for anthropology. And I now have a couple of examples of theorists who work within this, what I call body-centric anthropology today. That would be Czordasz, who has made a significant contribution to the study of religion that places a central emphasis on embodiment. I'm sorry, there's a page missing here. Paul Stoller, who worked on who centered his ethnography on the census, and Michael Jackson, a US-based anthropologist, who works in existential anthropology. And all these authors, I looked for passages in which these authors quote Malinowski and then try to see what I actually try to establish is that they quote Malinowski in ways that focus on aspects of Malinowski's ethnographic fieldwork that emphasize ethnography and lived experience, and by this perpetuate the Lebensphilosophie tradition that I try to argue is at the core of his methodological contribution. And with a view to our time, I can't go in all of these examples, but I would like to pick just one of them, and that would be Paul Stoller. Paul Stoller calls for a return of the census in 1989 and has further pursued this path for more than a decade afterwards. His first body-centric publication, The Taste of Ethnographic Things, centers on smell, taste, and touch, the brute senses according to Kant in his critique of judgment. Stoller's ethnography explores these facets of the human sensorium, which he deems to be traditionally neglected by the ocular-centric Western tradition. The emblematic historical anthropologist in this argument is, however, Malinowski, whose notion of ethnographic representation, according to Stoller, was, and I quote, to write a document that gives the reader a sense of what it is like to live in the lands of others, end of quote. Now, I believe that it is no coincidence that Stoller aligns himself with Malinowski and that Enlightenment rationality is set up as the foil for this argument. Stoller, in fact, presents a variation of Malinowski's rendering of embodiment. The body or bodily faculties, such as the senses, are highlighted as part of the human experience neglected by Western rationalism, and ethnography, through participant observation, is the endeavor tasked with their recovery. And in this manner, I am able to show in the remaining material, that there's a very specific way that Malinowski is read and cast by these authors within their argument that center embodiment. And so I would like to come to the conclusion that ultimately the legacy of Malinowski in this subsection of the anthropological literature consists of a theory of embodied insight. The body in Malinowski is not only an object that manifests culture, but in itself a means to understanding it. By granting an epistemological status to the body, Malinowski has transformed core notions of the Lebensphilosophie tradition and developed a body-centric epistemology specific to the ethnographic enterprise. Stoller's, Jackson's, and Schroeder's contribution demonstrate that this part of Malinowski's legacy has remained influential long after functionalism has been replaced by other theoretical approaches. Thank you very much.
Now I'd like to ask Marta Songin-Mokrzan from the University of Łódź to present a paper under the title The View of Bronisław Malinowski on the Problem of Engagement and Responsibility of the Humanities. Please. The paper is Olga Linkiewicz's paper from the History of Polish Academy of Science, Bronisław Malinowski Applied Anthropology and the Eastern European Perspective on the Big Questions of 20th Century. Please.
Thank you, and it was a pleasure to listen to both fellow colleagues from our panel. I think my paper relates very much to what Marta was just saying, and maybe I can add some things, just different perspectives, as I'm mostly historian, although have some anthropological background, but it was really a long time ago. So I would like to start with, don't worry, I can speak really loud, so I would like to say a few words about larger project, my book project, that this paper is sort of nested in. And as you all know, the interwar period, it was the moment that we are mostly talking about was marked by increased mobility among intellectuals in general, especially scholars, which included migration as a result of the World War and also the rise of authoritarian regimes, and direct contact, of course, during conferences, fellowship stays, and so on. This resulted in, I think, unprecedented exchange of ideas and experience between scholars who conducted research on both sides of the Atlantic and in various colonies. The main goal of my current book project is to write the continental prehistory of American area studies on Eastern Europe. This prehistory, as I call it, took place in the 1920s and 1930s, mostly in Eastern Europe. I focus on the case of Poland. Then a number of young social scientists, for instance, Józef Obremski, Józef Hałasiński, and Max Weinreich, received funding from American philanthropists, mostly Rockefeller Foundation, as you know, and also the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. The similar interests of scholars from Poland and American internationalists, such as national indifference, nationalism, minorities, followed by the conviction that Eastern Europe provided an arena for questions crucial for the global order, coincided with the engagement of social sciences in politics, generally public sphere. But this resulted in, as I said, exchange of knowledge and generally interaction between these scientists. Our protagonist, Bronisław Malinowski, played a crucial role in this exchange, and this was discussed during this whole conference. Malinowski's correspondence, this paper, and generally my research is partly based on with the Rockefeller Foundation representatives, also proves that what we look at is not exactly exchange of knowledge, but sort of circulation of knowledge, which involved also American experts interested in other than Poland, Eastern and Southeastern countries, and experts from these countries, such as Romanian sociologist Dmitry Gusti and his American fellow colleague, collaborator, expert Philip Moseley. Also, Moseley is sort of the major figure of the early Cold War area studies on Eastern and Southern Europe, including the Soviet Union. The setting for my today's story is 1930s Europe and London, where Bronisław Malinowski taught at the London School of Economics. Based on his rich correspondence, we may assume that Malinowski was restlessly engaged in building networks of power consisting of his fellow colleagues and students, academic and other administrators, and finally sponsors, including the Rockefeller Foundation representatives. Arguably, at the time he was more active as public intellectual networker and mentor than he was as a scholar. Especially in the late 1930s, the competing ideologies, particularly the disdain for a liberal democracy and peace that fascism and Nazism embodied, made Malinowski engaged in politics and public sphere. In this paper, I will show how these networks of power served as a frame. Could you please not use your phone, because it's really disturbing. I'm sorry. Especially in the late 1930s and przeszkadzam troszeczkę pana telefon, przepraszam, gdybym mogła prosić o jakby nieświecenie niego. So, yes, I understand. I want to show how these networks of power served as a frame for Malinowski to speak about his concept of applied anthropology and to engage as public intellectual in relation to Eastern Europe. I follow, of course, very briefly two cases of the big questions of the 20th century. Malinowski was particularly interested in nationalism and fascism, Nazism, connected with the rise of anti-Semitism. As it has been shown in recent historiography, Malinowski used his knowledge of so-called primitive societies to draw analogies between them and modern societies and to speak about peace and international order. I argue what I want to add to this argument, it's to Andreas, I'm not like showing anything particularly new, but what I want to add to this argument, it was that Malinowski's Eastern European Polish background and experience that play a decisive role in his response to the burning question of the time. First, I want to briefly discuss these networks of power Malinowski was involved in creating. The engagement of Malinowski in what I call a prehistory of American area studies on Eastern Europe was possible because of the particular position of Malinowski between the markers of the East and the West. In Kamil Robs's terms, Malinowski served as a bridge figure and intercultural translator. In Poland, Malinowski's position was strong despite a certain distance he had to his home country. It was mainly because of his career in Britain and later his contacts with the Rockefeller Foundation. Malinowski was in touch with his Polish colleagues and his methods, popularized by his disciples such as Józef Obremski, that Professor Engelking was writing about, were known as and respected among Polish experts connected to the Sanacja, the political formation that governed Poland after the Piłsudski coup of 1926. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, Bronisław Malinowski was a rising star in anthropologist's firmament in Britain and beyond. His pragmatism, clear articulation, and flamboyant also personality, I think, allowed him to win the favor of influential figures. Based at the LSE and later Yale University, Malinowski advised the Rockefeller Foundation and established close relationships with Edwin Embra, the vice president of the Rockefeller, and the two officers working at the Paris branch of the foundation, Tracy B. Kittredge and John V. Van Sickle, who was since 1929 head of the Paris office responsible for fellowships in Europe. Malinowski was an ardent supporter of young Polish candidates for fellowships, and this was through his agency that the Rockefeller Foundation extended its fellowship program to Poland. Such a fellowship offered an opportunity to visit one of the prestigious universities, as you know, in the United States, or participate in the famous Malinowski seminar at LSE. These fellowships not only improve a scholarly career, and this is quite an important point for me, but also served as a source of inspiration. They allowed scholars to consider the same questions through a different lens across geographical and cultural context. For instance, Józef Hałasiński, sociologist and the director of the State Institute of Rural Culture in Warsaw, carried out research on migration both in Poland and the United States, and it happened nearly concurrently. So he made these comparisons quite often. Max Weinreich, this we also know from historiography, linguist and leading figure of the Yiddish Research Institute YIVO in Vilna, incorporated observations he made during a short stay in the southern United States into his thinking about the Jews of Poland, particularly their exclusion from the society as it related to the African-American experience. For others, including Józef Obremski and Andrzej Waligórski, the fellowships helped to draw parallels between peasants in different cultural contexts. Malinowski was eager to draw these analogies himself. For instance, during the sojourn to the United States in the late 1920s, he, sponsored by the Rockefeller Foundation, he also made this comparison between African-American experience and the experience of Polish Jews. So he was sort of earlier than Weinreich in his remarks. And now I move to the big questions of the 20th century Malinowski discussed. Recent historiography, of course, has focused on colonialism, Malinowski's engagement with the colonial question, and the British indirect rule and the role of anthropology in regard to this question. But the rise of radical forces in Europe, fascism and Nazis particularly, Malinowski dedicated a lot of his time and energy to speak against them. As Leo Coleman has pointed out, Malinowski, quote, explicitly sought to make a scientific contribution to international thought. Here I will show how Malinowski's, again, Eastern European and specifically Polish background in various ways shaped this thinking. Let me start with the case that at first glance has nothing to do with Nazis. In 1935, a publication called The Kashubian Civilization came out in Cambridge, published by Faber. This book was a result of somewhat peculiar collaboration. It was initiated by the Baltic Institute, a Polish think tank from the town of Gdynia, and authored by three scholars: Friedrich Lorenz, German Slavist, from a member of the Ost Institute in Danzig, Polish ethnologist Adam Fischer from the Jan Kazimierz University in Lwów, and linguist Tadeusz Lew-Słowiński from here, Jagiellonian University. A preface, which is curious, was written by Bronisław Malinowski. Malinowski has emphasized that the book offered more than a mere presentation of a curious case, an ethnic group of Kashubs. It also went beyond making Polish national claims, although all its contributors consistently emphasized that Kashubs were northern Slavs, and by so doing confirmed the Danzig corridor was an integral part of Poland. Its main task, Malinowski argued, was to bring an Eastern European perspective to the Anglophone societies of Britain and the United States. In other words, American and English elites did not understand nationalism in Europe. Their knowledge of nationalities and foreign affairs was limited and insufficient in this respect. The role of an Eastern European scholar was thus to explain the essence of European nationalism and the national aspirations in continental Europe. According to Malinowski, the insight of the scholars based in the region was not that much a matter of their professional training, in this case anthropological and linguistic, but a consequence of their personal experience and background. We go back to what Grażyna Kubica was saying yesterday. He presented himself, quote, as a Pole brought up in the classical home, the cradle of modern European nationalism. Malinowski's introduction is curious, I think, for a number of reasons. First, Malinowski decided to lend credibility to the project that had, obviously, a nationalist agenda. This could be not only, I think, a matter of sort of courtesy to his Polish colleagues, but we may assume that it was also Malinowski's acute awareness of the Nazi appetite for Danzig corridor. Second, here Malinowski put forward his thinking on native anthropology. Malinowski was in favor of native, that is, insider anthropology, although he was not consistent in this, writing about cultures close to their cultural and ethnic background. It also seems that Malinowski's thinking went hand in hand with what American internationalists thought about Eastern Europe. I repeat, Eastern Europe was the scene where one could observe the burning question connected with the global order. It is clear that Malinowski, also what Marta mentioned, took the threat of fascism very seriously, fascist Nazism. In this respect, he took the opposite view to that of Sigmund Freud, who tended to downplay the danger and continued to stay out of politics. Malinowski, on the contrary, used any occasion to criticize radical tendencies and speak against war. In 1935, during one of his sojourns in the US, Malinowski gave a talk and interview which later appeared in the Cincinnati Times-Star under the title "Civilization Will Annihilate Itself." Malinowski warned against militarization. He asserted that the Versailles Order was responsible for the rise of Hitler and the fact that, quote, civilized Germans do not oppose him. Malinowski saw fascism and Nazism along with communism as, quote, the most dangerous forms of modern magic, affecting great masses of people and giving them confidence like the other magics, but actually unable to deliver the promised goods. End of the quote. Similarly, in 1937, in one of his sober assessments, he argued that war cannot be recognized human natural necessity and justified as such. And this is interesting that I just skip a part of it, but it's interesting also that this appeared, his thoughts about the war, in the Polish Jewish, mostly Jewish newspaper, Chwila, Polish language Jewish newspaper, I shall say, published in Lwów. Malinowski's poignant reflections on the situation in Europe are also present in his professional and private correspondence. This reached a peak in 1938, the period of fervent anti-Semitism in Europe. Then Malinowski was a few times suspected of Jewish origin by his Italian and German colleagues, and I cannot speak about it more, but I hope to have it in a paper that I'm working on and also in my book. Nearly simultaneously, his student Felix Gross, that Grażyna Kubica described in detail, was unable to get habilitation in Poland for being Jewish in origin. In a letter to psychiatrist Wilhelm Reich, Malinowski described himself as being shattered by the development of the situation in Europe, quote, complete capitulation of democratic powers, as he put it. In these letters, Malinowski often checked his colleagues, especially those from Germany and Austria, for their attitude towards Nazis. And just to go straight to the conclusions, for Malinowski, the events taking place in the continent were unignorable. Therefore, apart from participating in debates on colonialism and indirect rule, Malinowski spoke in support of peace and democracy and against fascism and Nazism. He saw the engagement of an anthropologist and more broadly humanists, I think he mentioned historians and lawyers in this group, as a moral duty. The major source for his reflection was anthropology and his research, as Marta mentioned, into troubled people. However, as I was trying to show, his Eastern European background and experience played a significant role in the way Malinowski responded to the challenges of modernity and the increase of radicalism in interwar Europe, and it's also very visible in the way in way he reacted to this when he was it was announced that he is a Jew by his colleagues from Germany and Italy. Despite criticism of chauvinism and anti-Semitism, he supported Polish nationalism as long as it stood against the German territorial and other claims. Malinowski's contacts with both the East and the West served as a frame which allowed him to speak transnationally and, as I said, serve as a sort of translator. Thank you.
I will turn to our colleague Marek Pawlak from the Institute of Ethnology and Cultural Anthropology at Jagiellonian University to discuss these three papers in 5 minutes, I guess.
Yeah, I will be very.
And then we will proceed with discussion.
Thank you so much for these presentations. I mean, three lovely, thought-provoking papers, which show Malinowski's anthropology as a sort of a modernist, engaged and reflexive project. And instead of recalling what you said here, I would like to point to some sort of a common theme that, in my opinion, emerges from those three different presentations. And this is knowledge production, I think. Like, three of your papers touch upon what is anthropological knowledge productions, and they touch upon this process in on three different levels and in three different dimensions, I think. Like, the first dimension is the micro level, it's Andreas' paper, and your focus on the body, on the embodiment, on the practice of the embodiment of the experiential. This is a very, very interesting and very basic context of anthropological knowledge production, and as you said, very, very important also. And it shows these affective dimensions of knowledge productions, which I believe and think are very, very important, because yes, emotions do matter, and they ripple, they impact the everyday life, they impact our positions in the field, and they create the collective, right? They create the social understandings, actions, and relations. So this was like the first level of this knowledge production, like a micro level, and the affective dimensions of anthropological knowledge production. Then, in Marta's paper, I see it as a kind of a meso level of knowledge productions, where you presented Malinowski as both as an engaged, reflexive, and the one who is somehow obviously changing his approach to fieldwork and to understanding what anthropology is about. And this is sort of, for me, a temporal dimension of a knowledge production, so mesotemporal dimension, because it shows that what we do in anthropology is always processual, right? It's always this sort of a dia ethnography, that there is the past, the present, and the future also. And this is precisely what you've shown in your paper, that Malinowski is dealing with these big issues, right? Seeing the past, the present, and also the future, and feeling responsible, right? And feeling that the science, the anthropology, should be responsible about the future. And in Olga's presentation, there's the macro level, in a way, of this knowledge production, which is about power relations in a way. And what you mentioned is East-West divide, which is very prevailing and still continues, to impact our own anthropologies, our own ethnographies. And what you show, this personal background of Malinowski, his origins, how they impacted his status as a public figure, engaged in these burning issues of that times, is very important, I think. And you use these very interesting notions of networks of power. Yes, and I believe that's very important aspects of a knowledge production, and it points to what Michał Lipovsky is calling hierarchies of knowledge, right? It continues to exist, and they are very prevailing, and especially we from the Eastern Europe, or Central Eastern Europe, or whatever we call it, we constantly feel this sort of a pressure, right? And the impact of that East-West divide. So I thought that it was a brilliant session that shows the complexities, the intricacies of anthropological knowledge production. However, I have one question. This question I can pose to everybody. What about agency? There was an agency in the title of this session. So what about agency in Malinowski's work? Can you, elaborate a bit on what is agency, or what was agency for Malinowski? Okay, thank you. It was very interesting.
Thank you very much for the summary. And now we have time for discussion. Please raise your hands and.
So perhaps I will start. I have some contextual additions to the papers, very minor, but may be helpful. You referred to this essay on Nietzsche published in English by Skalnik and Thornton. As far as I remember, they wrongly dated the essay as a student essay or something like that. No, it wasn't. Certainly it's in Malinowski's diaries from Zakopane time. So it was written in 1912, while he was already, quite deep in anthropology. So I think this means that the significance of this essay is even stronger. To Marta's paper, you mentioned this text towards the end about the intelligence something. Mm-hmm. This, I think, that was connected with mass observation movement in England. Malinowski was not connected to it, but I think he was asked by the organizers, Tim Anderson. No, I don't remember. I wrote about it, but names escape me. He was asked to write an introduction to a report they were doing out of this project. And in fact, I think this is a very important, as you rightly pointed out, very important text in which Malinowski openly stated that anthropology is not only, to be done far away with primitive peoples, but also at home. And I discovered somehow this text while analyzing the project of Felix Gross and his unfinished fieldwork in Kazimierz, in Krakow, of a Jewish part. And I showed that, in fact, Malinowski really influenced his students, Obremski, Gross, and Waligórski and others, to do their fieldwork in Europe. Also for logistical and financial reasons. But certainly that was the time he really was focused on European matters as something to research by anthropologists. And also a small thing with these Jewish accusations, one could say even. I remember when I found this problem in Malinowski's correspondence with his Polish colleagues in here in the 30s, because he wrote to Kraków, for instance, to Professor Stołychwo, a very good physical anthropologist, but not only, asking to write a kind of a a statement that he's not a Jew, but he comes from a noble Polish family and so on. I in fact, then back in the 80s, when I first encountered this, I was really struck. What was the how I couldn't that was just clumsy for me. And only later, Helena Wayne told me that she said, you have to remember that if Malinowski was kind of defined as a Jew, then in Italy they would take him this villa in South Tyrol and confiscate it. So that was not just the problem of, I don't know, social standing or something, but that was quite. Yeah. So and Helena was quite convinced that was the problem. Thank you.
Any other comments, questions? Yes, please.
I would like to add to Olga's paper something about Obremski. He undoubtedly shared with Malinowski his views on his anti-fascist views and his attitude against anti-Semitism. And in '36, Malinowski wrote an article called "The Deadly Issue." It is an anti-war manifesto. And Obremski translated it into Polish. It was published in a Polish journal, Marków.
Yeah, Marków, yeah.
And after the war, when Obremski already was in London, he published a review of Freedom and Civilization in a Polish journal appearing in London. So it was without the communist censorship. It is only to put some more information in this great paper, Ola.
Any other comments or questions?
And maybe I will also that this Abramski's review of freedom and civilization is not in fact a review, but it is a vast article which is kind of a tractatus on democracy. On democracy.
Yeah, but I think this is a very good point, you know, to discuss this agency as Marek Pawlak mentioned, you know. What about this?
Yeah, I would like to ask Marek to give a little bit of context. What do you mean agency? In what sense? In the field?
Please do
I
answer.
just-
I mean, agency is one of these notions in anthropology that is often taken for granted, right? It's the same with context, I think, also, right? And everyone talks about agency, everyone writes about the agency, but yeah, let's problematize it somehow. What is agency? Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's the question. What is agency? Is it like every action, individual action or social action is already agency or not? I mean, that's the title of the session, so.
Who invented this title?
Who invented it?
As far as I remember, that was dark.
I don't know, do we respond to any order or? But I wanted to add something based on what was said in the discussion. I think it's what I read in Malinowski's correspondence and what Grażyna started to describe, I think made me think whether Malinowski was, to what extent he was conscious about agency as such, because I think that if the term was then earlier coined, he would probably use it in a sense. But what I didn't have, for time reasons, to juxtapose in this paper was that exactly when up to these accusations, as you said, or suspicions, or just claims that Malinowski is a Jew, it's a turning point in a sense when he, being a Pole, I think, and Eastern European, but there are many dimensions to this, I think he sort of loses agency in a sense. So maybe that's the point when he doesn't feel things are under his sort of control, and he's different he has a different position in these networks of power that are very clearly related to agency as such. So to add something to this pragmatic context that Grażyna just mentioned is that I think that it's still striking for me when I read having the context of interwar period, the response of Malinowski, and also the fact that he engaged not only in Stołychwo, but also Polska Akademia Umiejętności, then to respond to this place. I think it's more, we had a discussion about it at my institute relatively recently, and one of my colleagues said, which is also related to what Grażyna, when he would be a Jew, he wouldn't be a Pole anymore. So probably his ability also to speak in front of his colleagues, not only, especially from Austria and Germany, but not only in Italy, would be different. He was, as you know, engaged in helping Jews, so it would be very different in then he would be seen as a Jew. So it's different in Polish context, of course. It's different in the international context, but I think it's still, there are many answers to this, including the fact that he was simply, we speak about 1938, so I think he was simply also afraid of being seen as a Jew at this point. So, but it's very much related to what, Marek, thank you for your comments, but to agency as such and his position, also in the American academia that he just sort of jumped into. Thank you.
My suggestion is to maybe to ask presenters to respond to comments and to remarks already presented. So.
Okay, so about agency, at least in the context of the paper I presented, and as far as I know Malinowski, I don't know many details from his life and personal lives on all those intricacies that you mentioned. I just read through his works dedicated to me as an anthropologist. So for me, I see this like he's really focusing in his work to give this agency to anthropology as science, and that's why he's always stressing science. He's comparing anthropology to biology, to chemistry, and that we have to be recognized as anthropologists, as as those noble scientists, and then we will have agency, the real agency. For me, like he's a kind of anthropologist that is like striving for building really like a culture capital for anthropology, and you can see it in Argonauts when he says participant observation. This is the scientific method, and we are scientists. We are not confabulating. We are not like saying some bogus and some things like that. And then in his later work, when he sees Africa from when he's flying this imperial airwaves, I really like this. I really love it, and I always think whether he really saw that, because he's like flying in an airplane and he sees the huts and he sees the Nairobi and so on. So for me, this is another way of this narrative flow of Malinowski, that he's trying to convince us that he sees that, but actually this is the way to present another method of actually working like with the cultural change, and he shows it in another chapter of this book. So then he sees that, okay, participant observation is not as, it's not as important for him in this African research, so he turns to applied anthropology. And you see, when we apply our theories and into practice, we will prove that they are true, and then that's how the anthropology again become as kind of discipline with agency. And I think this is the same thing that he does in this last book, Freedom and Civilization. So this is how I interpret that. But I know only him from those books.
I wonder if you put an agency today to convince our ministers of higher education that
I think this is exactly the same. Like for me, for example, his colonial flirt, with the colony. I think it's more like he was like frustrated that anthropology is not seen as a relevant, discipline that could solve all those problems. It's like we do it. We say like leave anthropologists to those underdeveloped, agencies, those agencies that will, like provide projects for underdeveloped societies, and everything will be okay. And nobody listens to us, and no colonial rule, the administrators didn't listen to Malinowski as well. But I see it a kind of parallel, because we live in today's world. We think that, we don't see those, intricacies, political intricacies, micropolitics and so on. So, okay, so that's how I see it. Sorry for taking too much time.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much, first of all, Jessica, for your comment on the essay. If I understood correctly, he was living in Zakopane at that time when you mentioned the diaries in 1912?
He finished his study and cooperation with Ellis. Not finished, but he wasn't in London. He just came to Zakopane to stay there and work on his own. That was probably cheaper than to stay in London.
And was that also the time where it was not the time where his connection to the anthropology movement, that was in the student years though? Because I built on this connection.
He was always connected to this Polish movement, he was part of it. So I think Natalia will tell us more about it after lunch. He was, in fact, who knows why he just stayed in Zakopane, was madly in love with this married woman, and he just worked on, he wrote Zimmer, he just worked with some theories, and I think that was the time he was to prepare himself also to do field work. That was like an intermediate between more active periods of his life. And one of the tasks was this essay.
Great, thanks so much.
I think that was just he found it interesting just to go deeper, to analyze it, to use his analytical capabilities, in struggling with this. But on the, you know, so that was one analytical thing. There was also, then he wrote this, or partially, this book Wierzenia pierwotne, so the only book in Polish that was to be his habilitation, in fact, but then, you know, his trajectory rather led him to London. And also, you know, he read a novel, Próchno, of Václav Berendt, you know, a very, very straight, I haven't read it myself, but it's rather, I mean, you know, I looked through, but Ozimina, sure you are right. So you know, so that was his preoccupations, you know, just to, you know, do something with some works, texts, and analyze it. And I think that was the most fruitful time in his life as far as this kind of intellectual mobilization is concerned. Yeah.
Please.
Yeah. Let me return to this agency issue that was raised by Marek. I'm not sure if I'm correct, but I think that the speakers were talking about agency in Malinowski and anthropology. Am I correct?
I'm not sure whether I emphasized the idea of agency, but yeah, I kind of can interpret it this way. Yeah.
Because I think that the issue of agency, that much more important issue here is to attribute agency to the, I would say, subject matter of anthropology. I mean, to treat, for instance, the Trobriand Islanders as really active and not passive people, and to analyze their agency also with mass of observation. I think that the issue is not to look at these British Islanders as just passive people, but as actors, so agents, I would say. Okay, so in this sense, I would actually see that the agency issue in the sense of Anthony Giddens and Margaret Archer is present here, but we would have to dig it out.
Yeah, they can respond to that as well. I don't think that I addressed the concept of agency explicitly, but in the tradition that I was referring to, agency would be thought actually quite similar to the way you differentiated between the levels of knowledge production between different talks. So on the level of the body, or in this type of theory, agency, of course, is a very simple term, and much later gets connected to intersubjectivity and these kinds of conceptual tools. But if you want to go all the way back to Arthur Schopenhauer, he actually has this very interesting way to define the agency, he wouldn't say agency, but the inner life of another person through their introspection. So it is about the question whether or not you can decide that another person has a body, like what embodiment means to someone else. And then he has this, I can, difficult for me to say this in English, but he has this way of argument by projecting one's own sense of one's own embodiment into another person. And he actually does this with interspecies, on an interspecies level as well. So even with Schopenhauer, he would be able to come to a concept that you can call agency.
Okay, one more question?
Sure.
Yeah.
We have still some time.
Yeah, I'm drawing on Marta's presentation because you took us beyond the Trobriands, and thank you for that. And then you also mentioned, Gupta, Ferguson, and Marcus, but the writing culture turn, in a way, who, perceived this Malinowski centenary as sort of a restricted, limited, and very hermetic. So, but why do you think that, this writing culture turn, and then in the 90s, with the, changes in anthropology, why did they only refer to Trobriand, the Argonauts of Western Pacific, and not the other works that you mentioned, for
But I
example.
think
It's a question for everyone.
Yeah, but I think we all do that. I mean, this was also a revelation for me. So when I knew Malinowski only, from his Trobriand research, and then I encountered other writings, but it didn't change anything. We still remember Malinowski through Trobriands, and it's like with Samoans I mentioned. Literally, Derek Freeman, made any change. No, he didn't. So why we do that? I don't know. Like, we should ask ourselves. I think that we have to generalize because we cannot know everything. Yeah. So that's why I think we pick up some bits and pieces, we put them together, and we present something. I think my presentation is also the same kind of, so I picked on certain things from his life and put it together just to argue about something. And I'm not sure why we forget about other, because he was really like, I was really like, it was really something important for me when I saw that so he mentioned missionaries. So he mentioned to look like broader in the...
Yeah, so
and
it's
we discovered
like multi-sided ethnography almost, right?
So why?
So,
I don't know why. I mean, this is how actually we do our...
Yeah, but maybe this is the case of the very clear marking point with the Argonauts and presenting the methods of ethnography. Maybe it's somehow
I'm not sure. I think from my perspective, we were kind of still digesting this model of research, and everyone was applying. And Malinowski was, somewhere else with his African research, with his, like thinking about war, civilization, and democracy, and so on. And he presented something, but nobody noticed. I think. This is my idea, because if we had noticed that, so why we, were so kind of, how to say this, astonished when postmodernists came up, and we just discovered that in the 80s, but why not in the 40s when Malinowski wrote about it? I'm not sure.
So maybe one last comment before the lunch.
I would like to add to it. From my perspective, I have the feeling there's something specific about this process of canonization to the anthropological discipline, in the sense that there is this sort of established historical genre as the history of anthropological thought. And if you actually go through the introductions to ethnology or anthropology, there's a very, very dominant narrative that goes from thinker to thinker, and every thinker is associated with a certain point in the development, and that seems to be the way the discipline settled on teaching itself its history. And then, of course, there are revisions to it, but if you revise, then it's the process that you mentioned. It's very difficult to come up with an alternative way to narrate the history of.
They're like kind of Latour's black boxes, I think. It's very difficult to reverse the narrative.
But there's also, I think, an issue here of how much attention is actually being paid to particular thinker. So you just said that the revolution cannot be made twice, mostly, but not always. Wittgenstein is a perfect example. There are other examples. Think about Durkheim, right? There's an early Durkheim, positivistic Durkheim, and late Durkheim of elementary forms of religious life. A complete bifurcation in the reading of that person. People who are more into early Durkheim never read elementary forms of life, and they think about it the way Malinowski thought about it, by the way, but for different reasons, and vice versa. Cultural sociologists who love elementary forms of religious life and deify this work, right? This is a Bible for them. They never read early Durkheim. This is just irrelevant stuff for them. And for some reason, we don't have, and this was for me, I have to say, fascinating to hear your talk, we don't have that differentiation, this differentiated view of Malinowski, even though we could have had it.
We do have it. It's Malinowski ethnographer and Malinowski theorist. And functionally, Malinowski functional theorist is not really taken seriously now, whereas his ethnography is still valid. And that's why we are here and we are discussing Argonauts of the Western Pacific and not the scientific theory of culture, however sometimes it appears. So certainly, especially in anthropology, this division of Malinowski is clearly seen.
But this evolution, right, of his changing views of what should count, or like expanding the subject matter of anthropological focus, right? That's a very interesting thing, and I think the lack of reception, how people refuse to, for example, in the United States, to review coral gardens, even though they were in constant touch with Malinowski, requesting more information about his fieldwork, then not writing this, even though they promised, and then behind his back, actually, so to speak, writing to others, forget about him. Then we don't necessarily have the problem of not noticing, although this is for sure also there. Certain people didn't notice, others did notice, but for different reasons decided not to speak about it, right? Which is the issue of power, of course, always there. It's a separate story, huge story, but I think what you also said about hierarchies of power definitely comes into play here. And
agency, hierarchy and agency, because agency and hierarchy are quite interestingly connected. So.
Yeah. And to sum up, perhaps,
As Marshall Stalin's.
Malinowski was really, I think then, especially in the 30s, he was, if we compare, if we think about other anthropologists, he was certainly in Europe, he was the most, an anthropologist with really big agency, because he could certain Rockefeller funding for his students, so that his students could go and do some field work, and then they were spreading all over, academic chairs in UK and elsewhere. So that was, I think, very important. However, I think that Alexander would not agree with me now, because later, Redfield Browns came to the fore and took it.
Yeah, but if you read letters of William Pritchard to his associates, it's clearly clear that was terribly there was a terribly envy. There was so much anger in his letters. How this Malinowski is skillful, a kind of manager, scientific manager.
But just to add one sentence, what was said, also his competitors came from international relations. He was so interested in, because Rockefeller Foundation started to put the money into this discipline instead of anthropology. Yeah. So it's also the late 1930s.
Okay, I think that we had very fruitful session. But now it is time for